In the spring of 1803, Jacob Glasgow appeared before Philip Scott, a local justice residing in East Nottingham Township. Glasgow wished to bring a case of trespass against Samuel Hood. On the surface, there was nothing extraordinary about this complaint, just a run-of-the-mill debt case. Scott had already served many years in the capacity as local justice of the peace for the community, so he was quite familiar with the routine process of civil complaints. But the circumstances underlying this simple debt case were anything but simple. Glasgow was not just a man using the Pennsylvania legal system to recover a debt. Rather, he was a recently enslaved man who sought to hold the enslavers of his wife Sall to their verbal contract. By 1803, slavery had existed in Pennsylvania for well over a century. The full extent and spread of the institution in Chester County, however, cannot be quantified before 1765, the year of the earliest surviving tax assessment. By 1765, slavery had existed in 48 of the 52 established townships in Chester County, with a total of 346 taxable enslaved persons identified by the local township assessors. The highest concentration of slaveholders existed near the county seat of Chester, now in present-day Delaware County. The second highest number of enslaved persons were held in bondage in the southwestern extremity of the county along the border with Maryland, the area where Jacob and his wife Sall were enslaved, and the area where this story will take place. Southwestern Chester County was dominated by the Scots-Irish Presbyterians who arrived in the Pennsylvania colony in great numbers beginning in the 17-teens. Here they established successful wheat farms and milling seats. Their commercial interests lay towards the south with Newport Landing, Wilmington, and the Head of Elk, which connected them to the greater Atlantic trade network, where their wheat and flour was sent to help feed the enslaved populations in the Caribbean. Much of their enslaved labor worked in the grist mills, taverns, and distilleries that supported their commercial interests. While slavery never flourished in Pennsylvania on the scale seen in the southern colonies, its entrenchment in Pennsylvania would continue well into the 19th century. In 1780, the Pennsylvania General Assembly took steps to eliminate the institution of slavery in Pennsylvania. Caught up in the revolutionary sentiment of the time, the legislators contemplated their abhorrence of that condition to which the arms and tyranny of Great Britain were exerted to reduce us, and rejoiced that it is in our power to extend a portion of that freedom to others which hath been extended to us, to which we ourselves were tyrannically doomed. On March 1, 1780, the General Assembly passed the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. The Act itself, however well-intentioned, was crafted as much to protect the interests of the enslaver as it was to free the enslaved. Under the terms of the law, all those currently enslaved were to be considered slaves for life, as long as they were registered with the county courts. Those who were not registered would, in fact, be considered free. The children born to those legally considered slaves for life were to be enslaved as Negro servants until the age of 28. This incentivized slaveholders to register their enslaved persons in the local county courts. The process produced a detailed list of all those registered enslaved people in Chester County in 1780. In southwestern Chester County, the majority of those enslaved in 1780 would remain enslaved for the remainder of their lives. Jacob Glasgow's early history is unknown. According to later census records, he was born in Maryland, likely around the start of the American Revolution. His original enslaver is also not known, but he was purchased by David Watt Sr. around 1783, 3 years after the Gradual Abolition Act was passed. A search of the 1780 Slaves for Life Register indicates that Jacob was either not enslaved in Chester County in 1780, or he was never officially registered. If the latter was true, the law specifically granted Jacob his freedom. Whatever the truth of the situation, Jacob remained enslaved by the Watt family in 1783 on their farm in Oxford Township. Unlike the enslaved women and children owned by the Watt family, Jacob, as the only adult male, eventually was given a chance to purchase his freedom. On December 27, 1792, David Watt Sr. wrote his will in which he bequeathed Jacob to his son David Watt Jr.
I give and bequeath to my son David the black mare he usually rides, and also 3 milk cows, and likewise to have Negro Jacob for the term of 4 years from my decease. And if at the end of the 4 years the said Negro Jacob can pay unto David my son the sum of £60, he is to be free, otherwise to serve during life with the said David, his heirs or assigns.
In what may seem a generous act by 18th century standards, David Watt Sr.'s subsequent actions cast doubt on any crisis of conscience he might have had. In addition to his stipulations for Jacob, David Watt Sr. split the rest of his enslaved property between his remaining heirs. He gave his daughter, Martha Cunningham, a resident of distant Adams County, an enslaved child named Sall, taking her away from her mother Rose. This was a full 13 years after the Gradual Abolition Act stated, "Persons who had heretofore been denominated Negro and mulatto slaves have been intended with circumstances which not only deprived them of the common blessings that we were by nature entitled to, but has cast them into the deepest affliction by an unnatural separation and sale of husband and wife from each other and from their children." Jacob's path towards freedom hit a roadblock in January 1794 when David Watt Jr. died, and Jacob was once again listed among the personal goods of an estate inventory. Though this time the inventory specified the value of his remaining time, 2 years and 11 months before he would be free. When David Jr. died, the administrators of his estate, his neighbor Matthew Ewing and his widowed mother Susanna Watt, hired Jacob out for 4 years. During that time, Jacob managed to save the £60 specified in David Watt Sr.'s will and was able to purchase his freedom in December of 1797. No manumission record survives beyond a receipt recorded in November of 1803 to document his freedom. By the 1790s, Jacob Glasgow had met Sall. Like Jacob, Sall was enslaved. Considered the property of Walter Hood, a prosperous landowner and tavern keeper, Sall was registered as a slave for life in 1780 at the age of 13. In fact, all of those enslaved by Hood and registered in 1780 were children under the age of 16. Walter Hood, a resident of Oxford Township, held enslaved persons as early as 1765. He had married Elizabeth Hayes, the daughter of John Hayes, also a slaveholder. Both John Hayes and Walter Hood established taverns along the Limestone Road. Hood's tavern stood opposite the Oxford Presbyterian Meeting House and came to serve as the social hub of the region. As members of the Presbyterian congregation, the Watt and Hood families were likely well acquainted with each other by the 1790s. In fact, David Watt's signature appears on most of the tavern petitions submitted by Walter Hood, beginning in the 1770s. Walter Hood died in 1792, and like Jacob Glasgow, Sall was inventoried with his personal goods on August 17, 1792. Hood made provisions that his property was to be sold and the proceeds to be divided equally among his heirs. By doing so, Hood understood that the children he enslaved would be separated and likely taken away from the only home they knew. Along with the household furniture and farming equipment, Sall and what were likely her brothers and sisters were put up for auction. On September 26, 1792, likely on the steps of Hood's tavern, Sall, Jean Jr., Phoebe, Mint, Sall Jr., and Bill were sold to the highest bidder. The children, some now considered adults, were split up. Sall was purchased for £48 by Elizabeth Hood Sr., Walter Hood's widow. While some of Sall's family were purchased by the children of Walter Hood, the rest were sold to residents of neighboring townships. When or if Sall and Jacob were legally married is not known. Considering the precarious legal nature of their relationship, the marriage of a freed man and an enslaved woman was likely unusual in this region. However, the court case that follows makes clear Jacob and Sall Glasgow considered themselves married, and so did their community. On March 14, 1799, Sall gave birth to a son named Jacob. This is the first documented child born of the union between Sall and Jacob Glasgow. At some point before or after Jacob Jr.'s birth, Sall went to live with Jacob on the farm of his former enslaver Susanna Watt, widow of David Sr. There, as any husband or father would do, Jacob worked to provide shelter and board for his wife and child. The only problem? Sall remained enslaved by Samuel Hood, who had purchased her from his mother Elizabeth Hood sometime after 1796, but before 1799. Sall was forced to continue to work for the Hood family, and any children born out of her union with Jacob Glasgow Sr., like Jacob Jr., were considered servants until the age of 28. Unlike Jacob, Sall and Jacob Jr. were not free. In addition to taking in and providing for his wife and child, Jacob Glasgow also provided room and board for the others who remained enslaved by the Hood family, some of whom may have been Sall's children or her blood relatives. Jacob received a verbal agreement from Elizabeth Hood Sr. that she would pay a set price for the room and board he was providing for what was still considered her property. With no written agreement, Jacob had to trust that Elizabeth would stay true to her word. For the next 4 years, Jacob continued to provide for Sall and Jacob Jr. and those still enslaved by the Hood family. The promised payment, however, never came. By 1802, Elizabeth Hood was dead. Sall and Jacob Jr. was still the property of Elizabeth's son, Samuel. Samuel Hood, now the current proprietor and owner of Walter Hood's tavern property, served as the administrator to his mother Elizabeth's estate. Around this time, Jacob entered into an agreement with Samuel Hood to purchase Sall for £40. However, when Jacob attempted to recover the money owed him from Elizabeth Hood's estate, Samuel refused to honor his mother's verbal contract. With no other recourse open to him, Jacob Glasgow sued Samuel Hood in civil court. The complaint was presented before the judges of the Court of Common Pleas in Westchester during the February term 1803. Jacob Glasgow's lawyer was William Hempel, Esquire. Hempel was a young lawyer from a prominent Goshen Township family. Likely attempting to establish his career and his reputation, Hempel took on numerous civil cases pending before the court. Glasgow's case was just one of a dozen he was handling at the same time. On the other side, Samuel Hood hired two prominent experienced attorneys, Robert Fraser and Joseph Hempel. Joseph was William's cousin and a former U.S. House representative whose term just ended in March of 1803. In a narrative filed before the court on May 13, 1803, William Hempel detailed Glasgow's complaint of trespass against Samuel Hood as the administrator of his mother Elizabeth Hood's estate. According to the narrative, Elizabeth in her lifetime was indebted to the said Jacob in the sum of £150 for meat, drink, working, lodging, nursing, and other necessaries, and attendance by the said Jacob for the servants of the said Elizabeth, which Elizabeth, so indebted, faithfully promised to said Jacob that she, the said Elizabeth, would well and truly pay. On May 16th, Samuel Hood was summoned to answer the complaint, to which he replied that he did not understand the promise. Likely angered by Jacob Glasgow's case against him, Samuel Hood responded with his own civil case. On May 18, 1803, his lawyer submitted a request for a writ of replevin, a court order for the return of property. The writ required Jacob to hand over his wife and child, who, under the law, were still the rightful property of their enslaver, Samuel Hood. The law treated Sall and Jacob Jr. as goods that were being unlawfully detained by their husband and father. If Samuel's attempt to recover what he thought rightfully his was successful, Jacob would lose his wife and child. The progress of the case was slow. It is not known what actually occurred after the writ of replevin was issued, if or how long Sall and Jacob Jr. were kept away from Jacob Sr.'s household. It was not until August 15th that the court ordered depositions to be taken in both suits, and an additional month before the witnesses appeared before Philip Scott Esquire on September 17, 1803. The only surviving depositions were taken in support of Samuel Hood's case against Jacob Glasgow. The witnesses were there to confirm that Samuel Hood had several bonds on Jacob dating from 1802, after the death of his mother Elizabeth Hood. According to John Watt, the son of Jacob's former enslaver,
I seen two obligations in the possession of Samuel Hood, in which Jacob Glasgow was bound to Samuel Hood for the sum of £40. One of them was a stamp paper, the other on plain paper, and Samuel told me he had them on Jacob for the price of his wife. I believes it was in the month of September last year that I seen the obligations.
A further witness, John Pugh, stated,
I've seen an article of agreement between Samuel Hood and Jacob Glasgow, signifying that Jacob Glasgow had purchased his wife Sall from Samuel Hood, and that the right or property of Sall was to remain in Samuel Hood until the money is paid.
Another, James Wary, witnessed the altercation when Samuel demanded Jacob Glasgow Jr. be returned to him after the suit began.
Sometime in May last, I heard Samuel Hood demand a Negro boy from Jacob Glasgow. Glasgow told him to pay him for his keeping, and Samuel Hood asked him if he could not take it out of the 40-pound bond. Jacob Glasgow said he wanted the cost.
The evidence and depositions were returned in open court on November 25, 1803, at which point the parties agreed to go to arbitration over Glasgow's case against Hood. On February 22, 1804, the referees reported that Elizabeth Hood's estate owed Jacob Glasgow $60, and the court costs would be evenly divided between the parties. While Jacob was not awarded all the money once promised him, he had succeeded in suing his wife's enslavers. However, Samuel Hood's case against Jacob Glasgow remained unresolved. By August 1805, Samuel Hood had died without satisfying the judgment of $60. Once again, Jacob Glasgow was forced to take the new administrator of Elizabeth Hood's estate, William Thompson, to court, declaring that the estate was in default of the 1804 judgment. Responding to the case, Thompson declared that all the assets from Elizabeth's estate were already distributed, leaving nothing to pay the judgment. Glasgow responded in February 1806 that the estate was not fully administered, and the case dragged on for 5 more years. In the end, on February 11, 1811, Jacob Glasgow's attorney, William Hempel, stated that the case had been settled and the cost paid. What the terms of the settlement were are not related, and it is unknown if Jacob ever received the money that was owed to him. Meanwhile, the case of replevin brought against Jacob Glasgow by Samuel Hood was discontinued on August 16, 1806, due to Hood's death the year prior. Samuel Hood's inventory filed April 5, 1805, lists 1 black woman and child and 1 black boy. Could this be Sall, Jacob Jr., and Lydia, a servant registered by Samuel Hood in 1800? There is no way to be certain without the names being supplied in the inventory, but because it is known that Samuel Hood purchased Sall by 1799 and registered Jacob Jr. in 1799 and Lydia in 1800, it appears likely. Whether or not Jacob Glasgow Sr. ever succeeded in purchasing his wife Sall, thereby ensuring her freedom, is not known. Sall Glasgow disappears from the historical record after 1805. Jacob Glasgow, however, would live for another 50 years, eventually moving to East Bradford Township. Older and in poor health, Jacob would seek assistance from the Chester County Poorhouse in August 1855. He was granted an allowance of 38.5 cents per week. By December 18, 1855, the account noted that he had received a total of $6.54.5 for that year. On February 7, 1856, the steward simply noted, "Allowance ceases, he being dead." Jacob Glasgow left behind a legacy that went well beyond his fight with the Hood family. There were at least 4 men born around the turn of the 19th century who bore the surname Glasgow: Caesar Glasgow, Jacob Glasgow Jr., Jesse Glasgow, and Samuel Glasgow. While it is not known if they were all related by blood, they were all connected to each other by close association. All but one of these men were registered servants by members of the Hood family. Jacob Jr., Caesar, and Samuel were brickmakers and helped establish and construct several African churches in emerging free black communities in Chester County. Samuel Glasgow was acquainted with the Dickey family, whose involvement with the American Colonization Society and Ashman Institute, later Lincoln University, likely influenced his decision to sail for Liberia. And Jesse Glasgow would move to Philadelphia, where his son, Jesse Ewing Glasgow, was the first student to graduate from the Institute for Colored Youth. He continued his education in Scotland, where he was accepted into the University of Edinburgh. While there in 1859, he would write a tract about John Brown's raid, wherein he would promote the abolitionists' cause. and by the time of the Civil War, no fewer than 12 of Jacob Glasgow's grandchildren and great-grandchildren enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment in the United States Colored Troops to fight for an end to a system that had once enslaved their grandparents. The Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 left a system in place that allowed for the separation and enslavement of hundreds of Chester County residents. It treated Sall as property to be inventoried and sold at will. It forced Jacob to buy the right to live unmolested with his wife and child. The story of Jacob and Sall Glasgow illustrates that the horrors of slavery forced on these innocent people before 1780 continued for over half a century after the act was passed. Slavery would not disappear from Pennsylvania soil until well into the 19th century. Even in Chester County, the institution would linger past 1830. Jacob Glasgow fought for what was right. Faced with the threat of the loss of his wife Sall and their children, Jacob pressed on to hold his wife's enslavers to account. He used a legal system meant to protect property rights and turned it against those who saw his family as property. Ultimately, he succeeded where most might assume he would fail. His fight and victory were not lost on his children and those who chose to bear his surname. They would build upon his success and continue his fight.